them to do. And they had a mission, they had a goal, and a military approach to achieving it.
There's scientific legacies, botanic legacies, geographic legacies that all coexist.
I think there is a frontier spirit, and it is alive today. Unfortunately, there's no more frontier.
As a history teacher, I talk a lot about the Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis on the frontier and what it was to be an American, that the frontier defined who we are as Americans because it encourages individualism, American spirit, democracy.
That's why we spend so much money at NASA, I guess, is because we still have that segment of the population who find it necessary to push on into terra incognita, places where no one has been before, where there's perhaps answers to questions that we've always had.
I also think there's a legacy that exists for the Indian tribes who were impacted by Lewis and Clark. Their vision of that legacy would be very different.
The average person along the Lewis and Clark Trail on an Indian reservation probably knows a lot more about Lewis and Clark than the average person that you ask in one of the large American cities. But their take on it is probably going to be very different. They're not going to be looking at it as a kind of wonderful, glorious quest or a goal that was fulfilled, but as probably looking at it as the beginning of an invasion by people who are different from their own tribal group, who came in and kind of changed all the ways of life and the rules of the game and everything within a very short period of time of Lewis and Clark themselves, because by 1890 they were saying that the frontier was completely settled. So in less than 90 years you have the lifestyle of thousands and thousands of people who live in the American West just completely changed.
To this very day, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara acknowledge that Lewis and Clark certainly was the beginning of change for them as a culture, and to this day recognize that so much that they have their own Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Committee that's working hard to commemorate the bicentennial and to tell the story with as many voices as possible, including theirs. What Lewis and Clark found here was a thriving, vibrant culture. That's the one thing we love to tell people, and let them know that Lewis and Clark didn't enter a great empty coming this far north as part of the Louisiana Purchase. That this was an area nearly the size of Europe, but more importantly, peopled with as many cultures as Europe, as many languages. The Mandan Hidatsa were an agrarian society, something that Thomas Jefferson could really, take an appreciation for with his views on the importance of agriculture. But these were people who lived in villages that at the time had more people living in them than either St. Louis or Washington City. But also buffalo hunters. They went to war. They did the classic things we think of Plains Indians. But first and foremost, they were farmers. And that is what sustained Lewis and Clark through that long, cold winter, was the fact that they had primarily corn, but beans, squash, sunflowers, other produce to trade with the members of the expedition. And that really was vital to their success during that bitterly cold winter here. On a daily basis, the Mandan especially, but the Mandan and Hidatsa both, would visit the fort, but also men would cross the ice, visit the villages, and the men would spend the nights in the warmth and hospitality of those Earth Lodge villages. And that's really a great, compelling story, how two cultures came together and really, had a very good time. Unfortunately, it's a very unique story in the story of westward expansion. It isn't also positive. It's almost like our little Camelot on the prairie here, because two cultures got along just once.
The civilizing influence you see time and again when you read about the American West only brings division and prejudice and a lack of cooperation, especially between social groups, that might have gotten along initially when they were on the frontier, because they had to depend on each other.
Even in something as simple as trade, and that trade continued all the way out onto the West Coast thousands of miles later, where the members of the expedition had a difficult time and possibly wouldn't have survived without that kind of interaction with the tribes. At Dismal Niche, it was truly life or death. They were reduced to powdered or pounded fish, dried pounded fish to eat. And at The waves were crashing on the shore. They couldn't move forward. They couldn't move back. It was constantly raining. They were there for 5 days. Clothing literally rotting off their backs. They had to sleep on the logs that were on the surf itself at night. Some of them, the men were getting seasick from the undulation of the logs on the shore, but there was literally no room for them to move inland. They couldn't, the cliffs were too steep to traverse. And in out of this pounding surf comes a small canoe with 5 Chinook Indians, and they traded for 13 fresh-caught fish, first fresh food they'd had in days, and traded for some fish hooks and other trifling items, as Clark put it in the journal. And then the 5 Chinook jump back in their little canoe and head straight out into 5-foot surf, and like a cork across water, headed out of sight. And Clark wrote in his journal that they were surely the best canoemen that he'd ever seen.
There is no greater national treasure than this land and its pristine condition. And if we pollute it and misuse it in the next 200 years, as we have done so in the last 200 years, it will be uninhabitable.
The population just of this region, the St. Louis region, pretty much is what the entire population was of the 13 American colonies at the time of the Revolutionary War. You double the population of this region and you get what the entire population of the United States was at the time of Lewis and Clark.
We've wasted more natural resources than we've ever used. We've destroyed more than we've ever put to good use. And if Americans can travel this country and see what's left, see what's gone, draw conclusions from that, and perhaps become better stewards of the land, to me that would be the most important thing.
Once Lewis and Clark and their team got back to St. Louis, they started to go their separate ways, and they really aren't sure about a lot of the men who went on the trip, what happened to them. They're just kind of lost to history. Some of them Clark kept track of and kept some notes on. We know that a lot of them got involved in the fur trade, and many of them were killed, especially in fights with Indians over the subsequent years. Lewis and Clark had different lives after the expedition. Lewis's life changed a lot because I think he was unhappy being the governor of Louisiana. He had a lot of problems in that post, and whether he was murdered or committed suicide is still kind of a question of debate among historians. But we know that by 1809 he was making his way back to Washington, D.C. to kind of defend his name against charges that he'd been misappropriating government funds, and died along the Natchez Trace. So he didn't live all that long after the expedition, never completed the publication of the journals, and all that fell to William Clark.
In this small portion of what's enormous, the Lewis and Clark experience is an enormous thing. The Camp Dubois aspect of it, I don't think anybody got more out of it than I did. I feel that I comprehend what these men went through. I at least had essences come from time to time that told me what the effort involved was.
This is not the bicentennial of a camping adventure. What this represents, and people across America and clearly overseas understand, is this bicentennial is the commemoration of 200 years of the American West. It's the bicentennial of the real America. 1776 to 1976, that was 200 years of 13 original colonies on the eastern seaboard. This is the bicentennial of the America as we've come to know it today, in Thomas Jefferson's words, "From sea to shining sea."
William Clark, who lived for quite a long time after the expedition, seems to have been fairly happy. He had a lot of personal tragedy in his life. Several of his children died young. He married twice, and both of his wives passed away before he did. His best known job was as the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the West, and he took care of a lot of the problems of relocating and resettling tribes, moving tribes from one place to another to facilitate American expansion. By the end of his life, and when he died in 1838, he was one of the only people who was really defending the Indian tribal groups. You know, most of the people were just gung-ho, charging ahead, trying to move the Indians out of the way. And Clark isn't blameless. I mean, he was a government official, and to keep his job, he had to do the bidding of the government. But he was one of the only people who was kind of dragging his feet and saying, wait a minute, you know, what we're doing, it may not be the right thing or the best thing for either these people, these tribal people, or for ourselves.
So that frontier spirit, I think, has all of that boiled into it. This idea to make oneself, that not to take whatever lot that they were given in life. The frontier offers that opportunity that if I was perhaps the second or third son of some English lord in England, I was probably delegated to whatever role my father gave me. But as a frontier, I could come and make my own fame and fortune. All of them, I think, had that sense of what they were doing. If you look at the journals, even written in the contemporary, written at the time that they were on the expedition, a lot of them speak of the responsibility that was given to them, you know, almost like a mandate from the United States and from the people of the United States to accomplish this expedition, to accomplish this task.
I guess I'm relieved. I'm very happy to be done. I'm looking forward to working with things that don't weigh much.
There was always that hope, or maybe it was a delusion that you could kind of escape your problems, whatever problems that you'd had, by going to the frontier. And for some people it worked, you know. I mean, there were people who were nobodies in larger communities in the East, and they came west and they became, you know, the bigger figures in a community. So they became the politicians and the people who were the large landholders and the people who called the shots in different communities. So some people became a big fish in a small pond, you know, by going west.
We might have come very close to reproducing exactly what they had. And so I feel as though I'm the one who's the beneficiary of this camp more than anyone else possibly could be.
All right, here we go.